Elex 2 has been in development for about 4 years now, which marks the longest Piranha Bytes have ever gone between releases. It's been an unusually long wait, in other words, but it's felt even longer due to an almost complete lack of information or press about the sequel's development during practically all that time. They've been so quiet about it that I don't think it was ever even officially announced that they were working on a sequel, even though we all knew that thanks to the European Union's Creative Europe Media program, until they debuted the cinematic announcement trailer at E3 a few months ago. That trailer was so incredibly uninformative, however. It was all a pre-rendered action cutscene with kind of a bizarre choice of music meant to hype us up for a presumably upcoming release without actually telling us anything about the game itself, as we got no gameplay footage whatsoever or hints about what had been changed or improved from the first game. Then we got a short gameplay reveal and a few interviews a couple weeks later, which was certainly more informative than the cinematic trailer, but it was still pretty vague and only gave us the briefest of glimpses into some of the ideas they might be working with in the sequel. It still wasn't much to go on, in other words, and so at that point I decided I didn't want to start forming any kind of impression about it until we had some more substantial, concrete demonstrations. 2 more months went by with no major news or updates. Piranha Bytes didn't even have a presence at Gamescom, where they usually tease big reveals and long demos for their upcoming projects, and the only thing THQ revealed during their 10th anniversary event was another pre-rendered CGI story trailer, which only served to show us things we'd already been told in other press releases. Finally, they released a limited preview build for certain streamers and media critics to show off, so now 3 months later we can finally get a better picture of what Elex 2 actually looks and feels like in practice. When the announcement trailer first launched, speculation was that we were looking at a release date of sometime soon, perhaps within the next couple of months. Bjorn and Jenny from Piranha Bytes said during one of their first community videos after the announcement trailer launched that instead of doing a full 2.5-year marketing campaign like they did for the first game, Elex 2's marketing was going to be a shorter blitz of only a few months.
Und jetzt wird das so sein, das ist keine 2,5 Jahre, sondern das werden wenige Monate sein.
Between that statement and the fact that publishers generally like to release games in time for holiday sales, I figured we were looking at a release date of late October or early November. But given that it's now October and they still haven't even hinted at a general time frame, like the 4th quarter of 2021 or the 2nd quarter of 2022 or whatever, I'm beginning to question if that's actually going to happen or not. Looking at the preview footage, I have some doubts as to how far along the game's development actually is, which is reinforced by THQ apparently stressing that the streamers convey the build they're playing is early beta.
This is like pre-beta? Early beta, they said. Early beta.
Bjorn and Jenny have also said in their community videos that with Elex 2, they're trying to focus more on density and quality of content instead of expanding the world for the sake of simply being bigger, and that there will be a more than usual amount of consequences affecting other things in the gameplay.
Ja, wir fokussieren uns darauf, das Ding vor allen Dingen gut und schön verteilt zu befüllen mit schönen Geschichten und dass es spannend bleibt und ihr eine Menge zu entdecken habt, sag ich.
Es wird hochkomplex, ja, es wird interessant. Wir verteilen das ziemlich gut, glaube ich, auf die ganze Spielzeit, ja, unsere Inhalte. Und ja, dass es auch sehr viele Konsequenzen haben wird, was ihr da tut in dieser Welt. Genau. Ja, das wird schon ziemlich viel beeinflussen. Ne? Mehr als sonst, das kann ich jetzt schon mal sagen.
In addition to other claims like that they're redoing all animations and trying to make the combat more fluid and responsive with more direct player control, that gives me hope that Elex 2 will be more of a Gothic 2 situation that carries over the good things from Elex while simply trying to refine and polish the experience while also adding a bunch of all new content and some new features, as opposed to being a Gothic 3 or Risen 2 situation where they throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, while needlessly trying to reinvent the wheel. Some of the features they're showcasing give me pause about this, and I'll get into some of that later, but there's already visible evidence that they're taking criticism from the base game to heart and listening to community feedback. Number 11. A flashlight. Just please, a simple flashlight. I would love to have a flashlight that the player can use similar to the one Crony U4 has. Which, combined with the longer development time and greater funding that THQ seems to be providing them, makes me want to keep my hopes up that Elex 2 will be an improvement over the first game. But as usual, I've been burned before with this studio, so I'm trying to remain cautiously skeptical as well until I can actually experience it for myself. For this video, I'll be using a few different sources to glean information about Elex 2, which includes the official cinematic announcement trailer, the GameStar preview video, a few of Piranha Bytes' own videos with Bjorn and Jenny, the Steam page listing, an interview by WCCF Tech, the official story trailer, the Fextra Life livestream preview, and ACG's preview. None of this is my own material since I'm not privileged enough to have access to the beta build, but I'll have links in the description for all these sources so you can check them out for yourself and support the people who made them. There's certainly going to be more information released in the coming weeks and months, so some of what I cover here will likely be expanded on further or may even be contradicted by more concrete information we get later on, so bear that in mind. If you're watching this video, then I'm going to assume you've already seen the previews, so I'm not going to recount all the information that's been revealed therein, and I'm not going to do a bunch of deep diving detective work trying to deduce what everything might mean. I'm just going to share preliminary thoughts and observations on what I consider to be the more important stuff. I'm also going to assume you've played the first game already, as some of the story details revealed in the previews are based on the first game's ending. So if for some reason you haven't already played the first game, then be warned there will be some endgame spoilers for that game in this video. As we could all safely assume based on the ending of the first game, the sequel will be dealing directly with the alien threat that sent the comet to Magellan in the first place. Following the conclusion of the first game, Jax evidently tried to unite the free people against the oncoming alien invasion, but couldn't get the factions to cooperate as they either didn't believe him or had more pressing issues to worry about, and thus Jax allegedly went into exile for some reason. 6 years later, the aliens have arrived and have begun transforming the familiar landscapes of Magellan with newfound dark Elex. I'm not sure what their ultimate goal is, but the ending to Elex 1 made it sound like they posed a dangerous threat to all life on Magellan, but that some might be chosen to live on in service of the aliens, hence why the Albs, under the guidance of the Hybrid, were so hell-bent on their conquest of Elex so that they might evolve to a higher level of being and survive. In the preview footage for Elex 2, we see glimpses of what some of the aliens look like. Some might just be new alien wildlife that evolved from Elex or the newfound dark Elex, while others seem to be teleported in by the aliens, and odd bits of purple stuff in the environment that likewise seems to be part of the aliens' ecology. So by the time we begin Elex 2, the aliens have already arrived and started doing something on the planet, and presumably Jax has to unite the factions to stop the bad guys from fulfilling their goals. My first point of curiosity is what the player's relationship with the aliens is going to be, or the Skyans as they're apparently called.
Skyans. Did you come up with the name?
The alien invaders gave it to themselves.
The cinematic trailer showcases an epic battle as if we'll ultimately have to defeat them and someone who is presumably their leader as part of the game's climax. My hope is that the aliens will be treated as an actual character with some kind of depth and motivation beyond just serving as cliché video game antagonists to give the player enemies to fight in the combat system. It would be kind of lame if they were just generic bad guys trying to expand and colonize the galaxy or whatever, and are just going to exterminate anything that gets in their way, and thus we arbitrarily have to stop them.
It's not clear what they want yet. All they're doing for now is spreading infection, killing and destroying. Not a promising start.
I would find it pretty interesting, in contrast, if the aliens were refugees fleeing the destruction of their own world, and our planet just happened to be the best landing place for them, with conflict arising from the simple incompatibility of our two biologies and ecosystems and what they have to do to the planet in order to survive. Or if they were on some kind of evangelical mission to spread their way of life throughout the galaxy and were trying to convert lesser beings to their religion and assimilate us into their culture, so that they perceive themselves as the good guys fulfilling a noble goal. Maybe there'd be opportunities to interact with them and do subquests for alien NPCs, kind of like we did with the Alb separatists in the first game, so that we can humanize them a little more and not just treat them like purple monsters that have to be killed because they're arbitrarily the bad guys. The Hybrid was apparently communicating with them, so there's some precedent of cooperation and formal discourse that would be nice to see expanded through direct interaction in the sequel. Another point to bring up with regards to the story is that Jax apparently sired a son during the 6-year break between Elex and Elex 2. The Steam page makes it sound like this is going to be an important part of the main quest, and the end of the cinematic trailer shows a final teaser image of what might be his son, Dex, being partially taken over by Dark Elex. At the start of the game, finding Dex is one of Jax's primary quests, as he's apparently been separated from him and might be in danger now that the aliens have arrived. I always found the family stuff in the first game lacking in execution, with Jax's relationship with his brother, Elex, and later his father, Nordic, both being handled so clumsily and awkwardly that they never really felt like family. His father just randomly shows up in the game world, for instance, before it's even been established that Jax has a father at all who's still serving as an active member in the Alb faction. Jax's sudden epiphany when he remembers his childhood as a berserker likewise comes off like an inconsequential afterthought and wasn't incorporated into the story or characterization very well. Introducing a son in between games is a little concerning, because they don't have a great track record of good character writing in the first game, but also because that potentially conflicts with the player's individual role-playing choices in the first game. Piranha Bytes is on record saying they're not implementing a save file transfer system, meaning they're picking canonical choices for what happened in the first game, and so there's potential for one's individual experience to be retconned if, say, you decided to do the nasty with nasty.
Forget the elves. It's really about your ass. I'm bringing the free people together because of your ass.
When, in fact, Jax apparently had both a relationship and a child with Kaya. Based on the appearance of Dex, this has to be something that transpired between games, not some long-forgotten thing from his past that's just now come up, so I'm very curious to see what their explanation for Dex's origin will be and what his role in the story will be. I'm guessing there may be something special about Dex that makes him a unique conduit for Elex or Dark Elex, which might be related to why Kaya seemed to have such a strong bond with Elex in the first game, and thus the aliens might possibly have some special interest in him, or he might be the key to solving whatever problem is presented with the main story. The other thing with the lack of save file transfers is that Elex actually offered multiple endings depending on your cold level, with Jax basically killing, neutralizing, or siding with a hybrid at the end, which would presumably have a drastic impact on how Magalam prepares for the oncoming alien invasion. In my Elex 2 wishlist video, I speculated this might be an area of contention if, say, the player roleplayed a certain way in the first game only to have Piranha Bytes force a different ending than the one you ended up with. But by setting the game an entire 6 years later, I think that leaves them enough room to write the story such that practically anything could have happened between games to reset the stage for the next game. Bjorn and Jenny say they're using that time gap to rebuild the story by saying that what Jax was trying to accomplish at the end of the first game, by uniting the factions and preparing the planet for the aliens' arrival, didn't work out, and thus leading us to a new situation by the start of the second game. That's probably about the best you can do in that kind of situation, as I understand it's difficult to essentially write 3 parallel storylines and then tie them all together in the opening of the sequel, even though I really would have liked to see them take a Wizardry 8 type of approach with that sort of gameplay and story design. So I'm expecting there to be a bit of a retcon at the start of Elex 2, but frankly I'm okay with it, because I don't think the ending to Elex 1 is necessarily that important to the story they're going to tell in Elex 2. It would have been nice to have the story flow a little more fluidly, kind of like how Gothic 2 takes place basically right after Gothic 1, but that, too, had to retcon the ending of the first game to make the second game work. That being said, I'm mildly annoyed that apparently none of my personal role-playing choices were considered canon. Then there's the question of how they're going to set the new difficulty progression, and how they're going to justify Jax going through the same power curve again, seeing as we already had him lose his powers once at the start of Elex and are now having to do the same again at the start of Elex 2. Originally, I thought they could maintain continuity with the ending of Elex 1, where Jax is already at full strength, and simply increase the difficulty of the world by introducing all new alien enemy types, or perhaps alien evolutions of existing enemies, so that the weakest new enemy type would be the same relative strength as Elex 1's most difficult enemies. But in the preview footage, we see an unarmored Jax fighting mass rats just like he did at the start of Elex 1, while the actual intro shows Jax's home and presumably all of his equipment being abruptly destroyed by the alien's sudden invasion, followed by him being bitten and thus infected by the alien creatures and falling off a cliff. So apparently he's losing basically all of his former strength in the span of a few minutes, it seems. That certainly works, and it's arguably necessary to set a good difficulty progression, but it's kind of a bummer that it seems to happen so crudely and abruptly, instead of being handled in a more narratively interesting way. There might be more to it than that, however, since Bjorn and Jenny claim that something happened between games which might explain him living in isolation in that hut. And during dialogue with Dex, Jax claims he was unconscious for presumably a long time and thus couldn't come and see Dex, and that there were these somethings before changing the subject. During the intro, Jax touches a photo of Dex as if he hasn't seen him in a long time and misses him, so those events he's describing sound like they happened between games and might correspond with what Bjorn and Jenny were hinting at. I'll also point out I'm not necessarily that fond of playing as Jax again in the sequel. As I said in my Elex 2 wishlist video, I was hoping we'd get to play as another protagonist and treat Jax as an NPC. That way it would provide a good excuse as to why the protagonist is so weak and why the player has to struggle with the power curve again, and would also allow for some interesting storytelling with seeking Jax out as part of the main quest. The way I figured it, they could do kind of a Luke Skywalker thing in The Force Awakens, where the protagonist from the previous installments has gone into hiding and is now this mythical, legendary figure that the new characters need to find in order to stop the new threat. The intro slideshows even go so far as to say that Jax faded into myth and legend, so the seeds are already planted in their story for this type of premise. GameStar has already revealed that Jax did indeed go into exile at some point between games after his attempt to unite the factions didn't work out, so there was clearly opportunity to do just that. But I guess now he's back again at the start of Elex 2 trying to do the same thing he apparently failed to accomplish in the interim between games, except maybe with an "I told you so" kind of attitude, as everyone now realizes the danger that the aliens pose to their way of life, now that they're actually here converting the world with dark Elex or whatever. I don't mind playing as Jax again, but it just seems like a missed opportunity to have done something more interesting with the story and situation, as opposed to basically retreading the same story premise a second time around, except by replacing the Alb threat with the alien threat. Another curious detail which gets revealed early on is that the old man who rescues you from the initial alien attack is apparently Dr. Charles Dawkins.
There is only one old man in the Bastion who fits your description, and that is Dawkins. Dr. Adam Charles Dawkins.
The same guy who played a major role in humanity's attempts to survive the comet and who eventually became the Hybrid, whom you defeat at the end of the first game. They actually showed this in a flashback, though they don't show any of the follow-up where he gets back up and you talk about using him or working together to stop the alien threat, which makes me think we're taking the emotional ending as canon, where the Hybrid just straight up dies. The whole point of Elex 1, though, was that Dawkins became mutated by Elex and had to rely on complex machinery and a constant supply of Elex to sustain himself, but now in Elex 2 he looks like a regular dude with a robot arm, and if we are taking the emotional ending as canon, then he should be dead. If he somehow survived, I'm not sure how he managed to look so healthy and normal. That leaves me skeptical if that's actually Dawkins, or if Dawkins has been secretly cloning himself or transferring his consciousness to new bodies to survive. Curiously, there is a mutated body that's been left behind in some kind of tank in Dawkins' original shelter, as seen in the first game, so that might be evidence supporting that theory, but I'm really just speculating here. I guess if they took the neutral ending, then perhaps the mana would have purged the Elex from Dawkins' system and reverted him back to a normal human. But if that's the case, then what has he been doing all this time, and why is the game treating it like a shocking surprise that this man is Dawkins? I wanted to know more about this whole subject, but the guy streaming never chose any of the dialogue options that would have shed more light on Dawkins. Next up is the subject of game balance. Piranha Bytes have said that they value the zero to hero progression that players experience in their games by struggling against difficult foes early on and then coming back later when they're stronger to defeat those previously impossible foes. That's something that I personally really appreciate because of how much rewarding satisfaction it brings to the experience and how impactful it makes the leveling system. Given that that's been a staple of their games basically ever since Gothic 1, that's to be expected with Elex 2, although it seems like they may have scaled back the placement of higher level enemies in the starting area, perhaps to make it less frustrating for new players. We haven't been shown a wide variety of enemy types yet, but in the live stream the guy is always running into weaker versions of basic enemies that seem to pose no real threat to him, like young jackals, young emberflies, young screamers, and so on. He doesn't encounter a difficult enemy that's meant to be too high a level for him until almost an hour into the stream. Piranha Bytes have always put young or juvenile enemies in the starting areas of their games, though those areas usually encompass a much smaller tutorial area, whereas this seems to be a pretty massive wide open area. But they also usually have a few more barometer setting, more difficult enemies like adult wolves, or snappers, or talon moths, or reavers near the starting area so that you can get a taste for how strong certain enemies in the world are, and so that you can actually feel like a zero at the start of the game. Frankly, the early stages haven't looked that challenging from what we've seen thus far, which I suspect may be a direct response to criticism that the early stages of Elex were much too difficult for new and inexperienced players. Personally, I played Elex on the hardest difficulty setting and relished every challenging opponent I encountered. I knew when I got one shot by the very first enemy outside of the tutorial area that I was in for a good time, but sadly it may be a necessary concession to make the early game significantly easier if they want to appeal to a wider audience besides hardcore players like me. In a new twist, however, they've also stated that they're planning to implement enemy scaling for certain major quests like companion quests so that they can be done at a point of the player's choosing, regardless of whether you're doing it early game, mid game, or late game. This worries me a little because I'm not a fan of enemy scaling in general, and I'm apprehensive of putting it in a Piranha Bytes game, even in a limited amount, because I don't want that to become more prevalent elsewhere in the design. I've always liked how the Gothic games and other similar types of games gave you choices about when, where, and how you wanted to challenge yourself. Oftentimes, if you went off the beaten path or focused on side quests early, you'd struggle a little bit more early on, but doing so would yield great rewards that would make subsequent endeavors easier, thus leaving you more prepared for the main quest. You could likewise do the opposite by focusing on the main quest, where you might wind up a little underleveled for certain sections, which then makes going back to the side quests a little easier. I like having challenges to overcome and deciding for myself when I'm ready to handle certain obstacles, or else pushing myself to overcome hurdles before I'm expected to. If some things end up being too hard, then I can come back to them later when I'm stronger, which yields the leveling system a more tangible, practical feeling of progress, and if some things end up being too easy, then it's a reflection of the work I've already put into exceeding that point. By scaling the difficulty of certain quests, they're removing some of those elements that I find so satisfying about Piranha Bytes games. Maybe there's a good reason for it if those quests are so important that they don't want to shoehorn players into doing them at a specific point in the game, and maybe they'll be minor enough to not matter whatsoever. I could just be overreacting here, but it's still a bit worrisome. As far as combat goes, Elex 2 is taking a completely different approach, one which I'm on the fence about as of right now. I really liked the idea of the combo system in the first game, with you having to chain multiple attacks together to build a special attack meter to be able to unleash more powerful special attacks, since that added an extra degree of tactical strategy to each fight, with figuring out how and when you were going to build that combo meter in conjunction with your limited stamina, while also having to time your attacks properly to build the meter faster. It wasn't perfect, of course, since it was a little easy to get into a rhythm of simply executing a full combo from full stamina, then waiting for stamina to regen, and repeating the process, but it was a novel concept that felt like it could have been expanded and fleshed out better in the sequel, say by giving the player different types of combo attacks that might use varying amounts of the combo meter to execute, with more active abilities to use in combat and more ways to use the combo meter. Instead of the combo system, we now have a charge attack system where you seemingly have a single attack button that will perform faster but weaker attacks, or stronger but slower attacks depending on how long you hold down the attack button. I see potential in this system for how it might encourage a degree of risk versus reward with regards to charging attacks for more damage while also leaving yourself more vulnerable to enemy attacks in the process. It might be a pretty reactive system where the goal is to charge attacks as much as possible while paying enough attention to enemy movements and animations to know when they're about to move out of range or initiate an attack of their own so that you can pull off as much damage as possible before missing your window of opportunity. If enemies have varying armor values or varying attack speeds, then there could be potential for having to mix your gameplay strategies up depending on what enemies you're fighting. A heavily armored troll, for instance, might suffer 0 damage if struck with light attacks, while faster enemies or groups of enemies might not give you enough opportunity to charge up attacks. On the other hand, I also fear that it could easily devolve into a case of repeatedly mash on the attack button doing quick attacks until it's time to dodge or until you run out of stamina, or hold the charge attack from a distance and move in to release the attack, then back away and repeat the process for every single enemy. On the bright side, the animations seem a little more fluid and there's a tiny bit more weight and momentum to the attacks, which hopefully would make it feel more responsive. There also doesn't seem to be as much or any of what I'll call the rubber banding soft lock auto-targeting system that has been somewhat standard in Piranha Bytes games of late, where attack animations for both the player and enemies tend to automatically snap the attacker into range as the attack goes through, thus closing distances and turning slightly to make attacks appear to hit when they otherwise would not have without the game making those adjustments. I'm not entirely sure what the intention was supposed to be behind that system, if it was to widen the attack range to be more forgiving for the player, or if it was a consequence of how the engine required damage to target certain hitboxes to register a hit. but it made some of the attacks feel inconsistent with things shifting around awkwardly and somewhat unpredictably until you had enough experience to understand how the background mechanics were going to influence things. It's hard to tell on Elex 2 because I'm not the one inputting the controls to know how the game is actually responding to inputs, but it seems like the attack animations and positionings are more fixed, where your character does a standard, consistent attack every time and the game registers the damage if you are close enough. There is a random moment when the guy charges up an attack and the character spins around almost 360 degrees, which might be the game auto-targeting the nearest enemy and not the player manually aiming his attack. Again, I'm not the one inputting the controls, so I can't say for sure. My hope is that the rubber band effect won't be there so that we can rely on consistent inputs and outputs to know what's going to happen, instead of having random variables constantly changing how everything appears to work. There's also some early preview footage showcasing aerial combat, which I can't say I'm that fond of. That, to me, is not something I was ever clamoring for while playing the first game or while brainstorming ideas for things I'd like to see in the sequel. I just wanted better jetpack utility with more upgradable stats and abilities. Putting in a full-blown aerial combat system is the sort of thing that makes me worry they're trying to do too much with the sequel and possibly biting off more than they can chew, at least with this part of it. Moving in a fully three-dimensional space is not always very intuitive or easy to pull off when using the WASD keys. I've played enough underwater and zero gravity levels in my time to know how bad it can be sometimes, and so I worry about it being a little cumbersome, especially given Piranha Bytes' reputation for clunky controls. But more than that, I'm not sure how engaging the aerial combat is actually going to be in practice, because it seems to me like every time Jax actually attacks an opponent, it's based on getting close enough for an icon to trigger over the enemy model, then pressing the attack button to watch some kind of elaborate animation play out, almost like a glorified QuickTime event. That seems like it might be pretty boring if you don't have much direct control over the combat system, but due to the inherent difficulty of navigating a fully three-dimensional space, it might be somewhat necessary to make combat actually effective so that you aren't constantly whiffing at thin air while struggling to line up attacks right. I hope it'll work alright and won't detract from the rest of the game in some way, but it's not something that I'm personally excited about. At some point, you're apparently able to unlock a jetpack upgrade that allows you to rapidly fly across the landscape like an aircraft. That's kind of nice as long as it's not unlocked too early in the game, cause in Elex 1 the jetpack only ever worked in straight up and down motions when it was begging to have some kind of lateral functionality as well. In my Elex 2 wishlist video, I was hoping for new jetpack abilities like a forward charge that could be used to cross horizontal gaps or as an offensive strike, or a jet blast ability that would ignite the ground on fire when you used it in combat. We don't see anything like that in the preview footage, but we can catch a glimpse of the jetpack upgrade system, which at the very least allows you to install sprint boosters to fly faster. Other upgrades look like they might reduce impact damage when landing, or allow side-to-side movement while hovering, or somehow increase vertical movement, or perhaps that's the ability that lets you fly like an aircraft. It seems like you can also find fuel upgrades through exploration that will enhance the fuel capacity of the jetpack by a small amount. The upgrade bench shows 50 fuel upgrades, so that might mean there are 50 upgrades to find in the world. Otherwise, the faster aerial travel seems like it could be a fun substitute for fast travel in place of things like horses, which I've basically never liked in any open world game that uses them. In Skyrim, The Witcher 3, Breath of the Wild, and Horizon Zero Dawn, I always ran around on foot because even though it was slower, I felt like I had greater control over my character on foot, and so I like the idea of being able to zip around the world by flying instead of relying on a clunky horse. That said, there are still apparently teleporter paths to discover, which may be to service fast travel until you unlock that flying ability with the jetpack. The concern, obviously, is that you don't want that flying ability to unlock too soon, because a lot of the satisfaction in Elex derived from the thorough exploration of its world, and if you can fly up every imaginable height or survey every area from above like that, then the exploration would likely suffer. There was also a degree of platforming involved with Elix's jetpack, which added a little extra dimension to the exploration, since you had to manage your fuel gauge to land on specific platforms and plan a route to access certain out-of-the-way areas. You couldn't just magically fly up to the top of a tall tower, it took actual gameplay and determination to get there. By all appearances, Elex 2 is going to follow a progression system where the jetpack starts out exactly like it did in Elex 1 and will progressively unlock extra abilities, and I'm certain they wouldn't make the jetpack too overpowered too early in the game. I do wonder, however, if there will be some kind of meta that develops where players learn to rush through the story up until a certain point or find certain upgrades sooner rather than later in order to make the early stages of exploration easier. that could be fun if it rewards you for doing things in an unconventional way, but game balance is also important too, and so I would hope it wouldn't be too easy to rush the jetpack upgrades. Speaking of the upgrades, the abilities tab looks to be somewhat similar to the first game in terms of what options exist, except the abilities have been grouped into related clusters instead of being displayed in a single columnar list. Typically, that signifies branching skill trees where you can only branch into new skills adjacently connected to ones you've already learned, but with only a handful of skills branching off from a single point, for melee combat and ranged combat at least, I'm not sure if that's going to be an actual gameplay feature in the progression system or not. We don't get to see any of the faction ability windows, so there could be more elaborately branching skill trees in those tabs, or those lines might just be a way to visually symbolize that those skills are related to one another. One thing that concerns me is I don't see anything in this tab that seems to give you new active abilities or enhanced combat animations. The melee combat in the first game had some good ideas and some decent potential, which was unfortunately tarnished by poor execution, but one thing that really crippled that game's melee combat is that it remained fundamentally identical from the beginning of the game until the end. You never got to unlock new types of attack animations like in Gothic 1 or 2 that would let you attack faster, more fluidly, and with longer combos, and you never got to unlock extra active abilities like in Risen 1, like to perform counterattacks or charge attacks or lateral AoE swipes and so on. And so that made your progression as a melee fighter far less dynamic and exciting. Here, in the General Combat tab, there's only an ability to passively increase your damage, an ability to reduce the stat requirements for melee weapons, and something that might be a stealth attack that does extra damage or possibly a one-hit kill when attacking from behind. I don't think anyone ever highlights that skill in any of the footage I've seen, so I'm not sure. The faction ability tabs will certainly have a host of active abilities for the player to learn to spice up the combat system among other things, but the fact that I don't see any interesting gameplay altering upgrades here in the General Combat tab leaves me worried that the core combat mechanics are going to remain fundamentally the exact same from the beginning of the game until the end, just with extra faction abilities pasted over top. If that's the case, then that would be a huge missed opportunity. It's worth pointing out, however, that the damage increases from improving your combat skills are now based on fixed values as opposed to percentages like they were in the first game, and improving your attributes now gives direct progress to increasing various passive stats. The first game had a notable issue where your character's progression felt like it was tied too closely, as in almost exclusively to your equipment, since improving your attributes did nothing to improve your stats except to allow you to equip new items or learn new abilities, and things like your melee combat skill only improved your damage by a percentage, which was determined solely by your weapons damage. That meant that, as a low-level character, improving your character's stats and abilities did very little or in some cases absolutely nothing to make the combat actually easier, and it made the process of getting stronger feel much slower until you could get past the initial hurdle. In Elex 1, for example, if you were to stick with the basic iron pipe and increase your strength to 25 so that you could learn level 1 melee combat, your damage would only increase from 20 to 22. If you were to do that same process in Elex 2, it appears that your damage will increase from 20 to 33 by adding 10 points from the melee combat skill and an extra 3 from the strength increases. Even without upgrading your weapon, that's a 65% increase in damage versus the meager 10% from doing the same thing in Elex 1, which would hopefully make leveling up feel more practically rewarding early on and ease up some of the brutally tough difficulty that tended to turn people off from Elix's early gameplay. Now's a good time to talk about the interface while we're at it, and personally I find it kind of bland and generic. A recurring complaint that I've seen about Elex 1 is that its UI was painful and a nightmare to use, but frankly I never had any problem with it whatsoever, other than it being generally uninformative or outright misleading about how certain stats and skills worked, and the nuisance of having to equip certain usable items to the hotbar instead of equipping them to your character or being able to use them from the inventory screen itself. Otherwise, I thought it was pretty easy to navigate with clearly labeled tabs and sub-tabs and decent enough icons for everything, and I thought the blue holographic scanline aesthetic suited the game's sci-fi theming very nicely, especially with how it immersively tied the UI into the actual game space by making it a holographic projection from an implant in Jax's arm. Say what you will about the rest of the UI, but that was a nice touch that added a little bit of extra personality to the game, which I find completely lacking in Elex 2's interface. Here it's just a bunch of nondescript black windows and white icons and floating text that looks like it could be from any game whatsoever. It's completely generic and uninteresting to me. Ultimately, as long as it's functional, that's the most important thing, and I do like how it shows an actual rendering of the items in the inventory, not just a bunch of white icons, but I don't like the general look of it otherwise. I do appreciate them showing a radial quick use dial, however, because the hotbar felt a little too limited in the first game with simply way too many things needing to occupy space on that bar and not having enough room for it all. I was hoping the radial dial would be supplementary to the standard bar, however, not in place of it. If that's the only way to equip spells, weapons, and items to a sort of quick use bar, then that's actually a downgrade to Elex 1, since that radial dial only gives 8 slots instead of 10 like the number row does. On the other hand, it seems like you can now equip weapons directly to your character instead of the hotbar, so that might clear up a few spots, leaving it with no net gain or loss. Still, I'm really hoping there are multiple dials or something to expand it beyond just 8 slots. In terms of the rest of the visuals, it seems like a mixture of good and bad to me. As anyone who's been following my blog or my channel should know by now, I'm no graphics snob and I don't generally care about how good or bad a game looks, as I'm ultimately much more interested in how it feels to play, but some things in this preview footage look subtly off, like there's a bunch of missing assets and graphical features. Most of the environments look pretty good at close ranges, with lots of plants and shadows and detail occupying the space, but at longer distances when you can see more towards the horizon, there's no vegetation rendered whatsoever, not even low detail placeholders to give the illusion of there being grass and plants on the ground, and it also seems like there's something missing that would ordinarily give a greater sense of depth to the visuals. I don't know if that's ambient occlusion or volumetric fog or high dynamic range or depth of field or what, but something feels subtly off and doesn't look right to me. For what it's worth, ACG's footage looks generally better, so maybe the Fextra Life stream had some settings turned down or off, but in that stream there's a shot during a cutscene where everything past the foreground legitimately looks like 15 or 20-year-old graphics. Other things, like the animations, show an increased attention to detail, like with how Jax's posture shifts forward or to each side more prominently when changing directions with the jetpack, or how he braces himself when bumping into things or sliding down surfaces, which are nice improvements from the more rigid-looking animations of the first game's jetpack movement. The actual character models are weirdly questionable to me, like stepping into Uncanny Valley territory. A lot of the characters look like soulless mannequins or animatronic robots, and Kaya has some really bad clipping issues with her armor against her neck, and even occasionally with her teeth clipping through her lips. Jax in particular just doesn't look right at all. When you compare how he looked in Elex 1 versus now, it's like his skin got smoother and less wrinkled while his bone structure got squished ever so slightly. It's especially jarring when it flashes back to actual cutscenes from Elex 1, because he just doesn't look consistent between the two games, and it's weird that they would show that discrepancy so nonchalantly like that. Granted, it's been 6 years and anything could have happened between games to alter his appearance somewhat, but it almost looks like he got younger somehow, so that's just awkward and jarring to me. He actually looks pretty close to his Elex 1 appearance in the cinematic cutscenes, so clearly someone knows what he should look like, but I'm wondering if those CGI cutscenes are actually being done by Piranha Bytes themselves, or if they've been outsourced to a different production company. Typically, Piranha Bytes uses their in-game engine to render cutscenes with only sparse use of pre-rendered CGI for certain intro sequences, and even then, only for certain games, so it's unusual for there to be such an emphasis on cinematic cutscenes in Elex 2. The fact that there are so many of them and that they look so good indicates they've either stepped up their game significantly, such as by hiring extra talent specifically to focus on cutscenes like that, or else by dedicating more production time to the cutscenes, which would be concerning if that's the case given how everything else looks, since I would prefer more time and focus to be put on the actual game and not the cutscenes, or else THQ is paying someone else to do it while Piranha Bytes focuses on the actual game design. There's a prominent moment, for instance, where a cutscene butts in and simply doesn't match the flow of the preceding gameplay. In the live stream, the guy's calmly wandering around an environment with a bunch of visible trees and vegetation, almost completely oblivious to the fact that there are two alien creatures up ahead, and then it cuts right to Jax seemingly already ahead of the aliens frantically running away from them when he only barely acknowledged them before the cutscene triggered, with suddenly no trees or vegetation anywhere in sight. It just does not match what was happening in the actual game space, so it feels like something that was made completely out of context, possibly for some other purpose, like, say, a standalone trailer, and was then clunkily shoehorned into the game after the fact. I'm not a big fan of the FOV and camera placement, as it feels a little too tight for what is supposed to be an expansive open-world gameplay experience. I usually like to pull the camera back in these types of games so that I can see more of the environment and have a better sense of how my spatial positioning relates to my surroundings, and here the camera placement is so close to your back as to be constricting and almost claustrophobic. That's good when you're indoors or in other smaller locations where a distant camera would interfere with the walls and things, but I would certainly like to have the option to control the camera zoom like you can do in basically all of Piranha Bytes' other games. Maybe it's possible and the guy just didn't experiment with the camera zoom. It's also really weird to me that the camera seems to shift orientations, with it sometimes being centered behind the back, sometimes offset slightly to the right, and sometimes offset even farther right. I don't like it being crazy offset like that, and while I'm generally okay with either centered or slightly offset, I'd want for it to be consistent one way or the other, or even better, with the option to choose my own camera placement. I also noticed a few jarring lapses in immersive design, which seem like they should be easily rectifiable but weren't properly thought out yet. In the Fextra Life stream, the guy tries attacking an NPC, and the NPC makes no reaction to it whatsoever. He doesn't even take damage. That's really not something that should be happening in a Piranha Bytes game. Even in the first Elex, you can attack and kill pretty much everyone and the game will react in some kind of way. And while we're at it, I really miss how the original Gothic way back in 2001 let you talk to every single NPC in the game. Even if they didn't have anything particularly important to say and spouted the same generic lines as every other generic NPC, they could still tell you things about the setting, which contributed in part to why that game felt so lived in and real. Here in Elex 2, filler characters just spout the same simplistic line over and over again like a bunch of primitive NPCs from a game made in the early 1980s, except with even less substance than some games of that era. Next, there's a moment when the guy runs into a room full of obvious weapons sitting on display racks which can't be interacted with whatsoever, and that, again, is something that just makes no sense whatsoever and shouldn't exist in the game like that. The intention, I suppose, is to limit the game balance so that you don't find good weapons so easily, but if that's the case, then just don't render obvious weapons in the environment like that. Put a bunch of generic crates around that the player can't open, or put something else there instead. Or how about if those weapons were all crappy, broken, low-level weapons that were effectively worthless so the player wouldn't want to take them and wouldn't benefit from it if they did? Or how about if those weapons are coded as personal property and there's a high-level guard there who will attack you if you try to steal them? One minor nuisance is that you now apparently have to click and hold to pick up items, and adding 1 extra second of delay on top of the existing grab animation seems like it could get tedious over time with how much loot you typically pick up at one time in these games. I like the idea of using press and hold to interact with things in the environment like chairs or radios or beds or whatever, but not for picking up items. On a positive note, I'm pleased to say that some of the things I was hoping for in my Elex 2 wishlist video seem to have made their way into the sequel. As I already showed at the beginning of this video, they're giving us an actual flashlight this time around, which should prove more functional and more atmospheric than the annoying magnesium flares from the first game, and they're also claiming that the nights will be darker this time around, thereby fixing their broken lighting system that got patched into the original game and made nights way too bright. There also seems to be more focus and direction at the start of the main quest. In Elex 1, there's no clear goal you're trying to accomplish when the game first dumps you into its world, and that can make it a little harder for new players to get into the experience if they aren't already intrinsically invested in exploring the world and getting stronger. In Elex 2, you're given a clear and concise objective right from the start: go to the Bastion and talk to Adam, who presumably sets you on another stage of the main quest. You also start with a quest to find your missing son, Dex, and you can find Kaya along the way to reaching Adam. She has more information on Dex and can point you towards fulfilling that objective too. So it appears like you'll have the same freedom as in the first game to wander around simply exploring the world and challenging yourself to overcome its obstacles if you desire, but at least this time around you'll have the option to actually pursue the main questline in some capacity from the start, as opposed to wandering around aimlessly trying to find it like in the first game, which should help to provide better context for what's going on and what you're ultimately trying to accomplish in the world. Another one of my wishlist items was to return to the map from Elex 1 Gothic 2 style, with a bunch of changes to familiar locations to reflect a dramatic new situation, and that seems to be the case here. It seems at some point between games, the Berserkers conquered Tavar and managed to convert the desert into lush green lands with their world hearts, and we can see a bit of map footage that correlates to the area between Edan and Tavar. . 。  . 。 . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . I'm not sure entirely how much of the old map will be available on Elex 2, and I'm almost certain it won't be as nostalgic as going back to the colony in Gothic 2, because the map in Elex 1 wasn't anywhere near as memorable, but I'm hoping that will prove fun and interesting in a creative sort of way, and not like a lazy rehash like it kind of was on Risen 3 when you return to a few islands from Risen 2. That's about all I have thus far, at least for the main things that actually stand out to me. Overall, the footage leaves me with mixed reactions where I can't say I'm terribly excited for the game just yet. As of right now, it still seems like a work in progress, which makes sense seeing as this is allegedly early beta, but I have to wonder how much will change between now and the final product. Some things may just be temporary placeholders, while other things may be part of the final vision. Some things look promising, and it's nice to see that they took feedback into consideration with the sequel, but other things also look to be a little lacking and mildly concerning, unless there's more to certain gameplay systems that we haven't seen yet. I'm really hoping that Piranha Bytes have been using this extra time to properly polish the technical aspects and flesh out their gameplay systems sufficiently, and that beta testing will bring ample opportunity for improvements. But as of right now, I'm in no rush to see the game released and would prefer that they take all the time they need to make it as good as it can be.